Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that won't employ Tony Abbott. We have standards. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yes, no, I'm very good. I think we're going to carry on what we've been doing for the last few weeks. The only difference here is that the season number has ticked over, so this is episode 401. Welcome to season 4. And we're going to go straight on into those headlines. So our first headlines are from The Independent: PM's culture wars divide Britain, warns Davey. And then from The Express: Britannia rules BBC U-turn over proms protest.
Yeah, this is one of the big stories that's been dominating UK news for the past week or so. And I guess my main gripe is that I think it really shouldn't. I think we've got bigger things to worry about now, which is kind of what Ed Davey, the new Liberal Democrat leader. By the way, did you know the Liberal Democrats have a new leader?
I do, because I happen to be in his constituency, so it was hard to miss. I, in fact, had a phone call from them being like, "Are you aware he's running for leader?" And I was like, "Yes." And we had discussions. It's definitely been explained around here, and I've seen a fair. Like, it's a bit weird, kind of seeing advertising for a leadership run. I don't think I've ever been anywhere where that kind of mattered before. But yeah, there was just a little bit of advertising, not a massive amount, but yeah.
I must think I think you must have one of the few Liberal Democrat constituencies in the country now. I can't remember how many MPs the Lib Dems have, but it's not a load. It's not back to like the Kennedy or Clegg days where they have 30. It's in the tens, is that right?
It's definitely around that. It's let me just check for you. 11, pardon me, of which 4 are in Scotland, and none in Wales. So, 1/7 of the MPs not far from my door.
A quick sidetrack about the Lib Dems, actually, while we're here. I always think that the Lib Dems had try and get this in a nice way.
While you're thinking of how to say that, I just want to point out that Lena Moran, who was the person who ran against Ed Davey for leader this time, because Ed was was the temporary leader anyway, following the general election. She ran against him, and the only reason I recognise her or know her is she had a caption put above her by the BBC which read, "Lib Dem enjoys not feeling sad after an election."
Which is a very Lib Dem caption, I feel.
Yeah.
It's just like, oh, bless. No, I think on a side note, just the Lib Dems are in a very odd place now. When they had the 2019 election, I felt they stood for something, and at least they were bold in their electoral strategy, even if it didn't pay off. Because, in 2019, I felt that the Lib Dems actually stood for something or had something unique that set them apart from the other parties, in particular their stance about the Brexit referendum, saying that if we get any type of power, be that in coalition or full power, yes, they were likely only to get coalition power, that they would do something to stop that referendum result from going ahead. It was bold, and I think looking back on it, they see that as an electoral error, although it brought them results in sort of Labour Lib Dem marginals. It wasn't enough of a electoral strategy to turn that into any great number of seats or cause any great upset. And now I think that's turned into the new leader, Davey, saying that the Lib Dems wouldn't try and stop Brexit again. That's not their current position. And I think without that, then they are sort of struggling to forge a political identity for themselves in an arena which has a Keir Starmer-led Labour Party that's increasingly lurching towards the centre, and that's the ground the Lib Dems have held since Corbyn has been in power. Previously, in the Kennedy days, they were to the left of Labour, and I think they were sort of picking up quite a few votes because of that, and even the Clegg days. Of course, the coalition forced them to the centre. They were able to fill... I feel that they were filling a lot of people's, like, the political vacuum for, I want a centrist party in some sense, between 2017 and 2019. I just feel now they need to go out there and find their identity again. You know, what do the Lib Dems really stand for, and how are they different from the other two political parties? I think I would say they're very different from the Conservatives, but when you compare them to Keir Starmer's Labour, maybe it's the fact that nobody's quite sure what Keir Starmer's Labour stands for at the moment. It's very early days, but with out an election in 4 years' time, it is tough to differentiate. And I feel if I was a pragmatic voter, I would say, well, I'll vote Labour instead of Lib Dem because I think Labour have a far greater chance of getting into power and unseating Boris Johnson than the Lib Dems do at the moment. But yeah, I don't know what your thoughts are on.
So I've not been following them too closely recently. There's been too much going on with, gestures vaguely outside. That has kept my attention. But one thing I have noticed from some people who I know were previously Labour voters, that I think maybe kind of lines up back when Labour was more central under Tony Blair, and we had that there still were Lib Dem MPs. We've spoken before that the Lib Dems do well on local issues. They get in as councillors and stuff like that, and then they do well locally. People know who they are, so when they run for MP, they can then become an MP in that area. So that's one way the Lib Dems have traditionally got seats. And I think the other thing is the Lib Dems are kind of interesting because when we talk about centrist and left and right, we're often referring to economic policy underneath. And I think the thing that's interesting is when, in a long time ago, not so more recently, but the Lib Dems were often proponents for social change ahead of what Labour was proposing. While economically they were more central, they were, they're kind of like this weird mix between kind of trying to be a bit more sensible with money and like courting those kind of left-leaning conservative voters. But then you also get generally progressive ideas on social issues. And obviously there were some issues because Tim Farron was leader, and Tim Farron was quite religious, and there were discussions around whether he was homophobic and things like that. But I have seen people discussing at the moment that the Labour Party is not really focusing well on trans issues and trans rights, whereas Lib Dems have a good record for that. So while it may not be, like I have seen people, saying things like, I don't like Ed Davey particularly because of voting record and X, Y, and Z, but when you compare to trans rights and how they've been represented by Labour so far and how Keir Starmer's not dealing with X, Y, and Z, which are issues I've not fully looked into, I know that's definitely something that's there at the moment. So I wonder if that's the kind of differentiator they'll try to lean on again, which worked for them maybe 10, 15 years ago under a Labour government.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And they've got a lot of time to make their voice heard. I think now Ed Davey is a permanent leader. At least gives him the voice to go out and say what he wants to and, be clear on issues. And I think that's exactly what this headline does. I think he's drawing quite a big line in the sand about the culture wars and how it's, I think I agree with Davey on this point that we're trying to rerun certain battles behind the scenes that only serve to divide Britain rather than unite it. And these sort of culture war topics has been a tactic that's been used by people like Boris and like Trump to sort of cause flare-ups. It's almost like a 50-50 issue that might be based on what generation you're from, how your ideals change from, a person in their 60s to a person in their 20s. The one that was picked up on this time round was about the singing of Rule Britannia at the proms. So I don't know if you knew the background to this story, Tom.
Well, I didn't when I first saw the headline, and I think maybe that's a point we're going to discuss a bit more if we have time. That these are often stories where you see the headline being shared, and the headlines are definitely crafted in a certain way to draw a certain type of reaction, and you get very much the left-leaning and the right-leaning papers presenting the two sides of the story in their headlines. And because it's not, I think at the moment, because it's not, important stuff about coronavirus and stuff like that, it's the kind of thing where people might only read the headlines instead of delving in deeper, which leads to some interesting discourse on Twitter. Discourse might be the wrong phrase.
Yes, mudslinging or bile might be better. But the gist of the story was, so proms happen every year, right? And at the end of the proms, they sing Land of Hope and Glory and Rule Britannia. Very patriotic. Lots of people in is it the Albert Hall?
It's the Royal Albert Hall, yes.
The Royal Albert Hall, yes.
And there's normally a load of people in Hyde Park with a big screen, but obviously right now a lot of these things are different.
Yeah, precisely. Waving their flags, and it's meant to be a big symbol of patriotism. This year, of course, the proms are going ahead, but there's no audience. And importantly, there'll be no the BBC said that there would be no choir to sing. In particular, they wouldn't be able to sing the words of Rule Britannia, which then became a bit of a storm in a teacup, as those on the right, or those who like to stir up these culture wars, and basically those who have a bit of a chip on their shoulder about the BBC already, people like Nigel Farage, etc., who see the BBC as a left-leaning organisation, even though I might say I think that's as far from the truth. We've had a discussion about the BBC in the past, and the BBC's role is to be impartial. The fact that the words of Rule Britannia wouldn't be sung caused a big furore on the right, and suddenly you had papers like the Mail and the Express saying, what an unpatriotic act. The BBC are essentially censoring us. They're refusing to have the words of Rule Britannia said. And the lyrics that were picked up on the most were, Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves, Britons never, ever, ever shall be slaves. And it was the use of the word slaves and linking that to the Black Lives Matter protest that made certain people on Twitter think that it was another example of Black Lives Matter censoring or trying to erase part of their culture or history. Now, I must say very quickly to that point, I don't believe Black Lives Matter are trying to do anything of the sort. It's kind of a repeat of the statue debate that I think we had on this podcast.
I just want to be very clear. Firstly, Black Lives Matter is not like a single organization. It's a hashtag. It's I think people are trying to. It's like when people used to say the communists in the McCarthy era in America. Someone has decided in certain right-leaning circles that if they say Black Lives Matter, that means a thing that doesn't exist. And again, I think we can talk on it here and also a bit more about the BBC in a second with their new Director General. But this is very much a non-story where people have decided to release this story, as you say, and it's maybe, one of the things people say is the Tory government may be leaning on the right-leading papers to release stories like this, and then you end up with this ongoing spat on Twitter. But it very much seems like, firstly, there is no Black Lives Matter group out there trying to censor things, which I think all of our listeners will be aware that is the case, but I just want to say that just to be on the record. But the other thing is, no one is going around and saying no one has changed the lyrics to Rule Britannia. It's like the whole, you see this a lot when people talk about, PC culture and things like this, and they talk about things we're not allowed to say anymore. Generally, that's because there has been a outright lie in a newspaper, often retracted in tiny print on page 16 weeks later after they get told off, because we don't have a very good way of dealing with that in this country. And people then get that in their head. It's similar to the EU rules on straight bananas. These are all things that enter the public consciousness that are not true, but they stick around and they do damage for far longer because they're an interesting story, and humans are very good at grabbing onto an interesting story if it slightly aligns with your political views. And it becomes part of the culture, a thing I remember as a kid hearing about those silly EU laws doing blah, blah, and blah. And, when you're a kid and you don't necessarily analyse these things, you can pick those up, even if you're in a fairly liberal household. So, yeah, they stick around, these ideas that are not correct within the zeitgeist.
Yeah, precisely. And I think it's that zeitgeist idea of Black Lives Matter, like you said, isn't there's no invisible hand here. There's no group saying we must ban it. But because it's in the public consciousness, it did make me, it's made me think Rule Britannia's lyrics are kind of stuck in the 1740s when it was written. And maybe we should have a conversation about why we sing this and is it the best thing? It's good to have a conversation and start those debates. But those, the Express and the Mail and those sort of papers wish to turn it into a war of, no, people are trying to ban the thing you've done forever and trying to destroy your culture. And that's wrong, but it sells a lot of papers and it causes a big debate. And when Ed Davey says that the PM is trying to stoke these culture wars, because Boris Johnson even came out, he was asked about it and spoke about it in a BBC interview when I can't remember if he was in a school or a factory or somewhere. I think he was wearing a high-vis jacket. But anyway, he was, he said, I think it's terrible that the BBC have banned it. And, he clearly saw it as a way of stoking up his support by permeating this kind of myth that the BBC had banned it, when actually, if you look at it, the BBC had kind of said, hey, I don't think we're going to run a choir this year because of the Rona. So, it's these sort of talking points that I think some people, I mean, in particular, most people say it is the right that stokes the culture wars, but there's usually got to be an opposing force on the other side, at least for there to be a battle. Or the right.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I'm not saying. What I'm saying is that these headlines that tend to be incorrect tend to come out in right-leaning papers, and I'll get to this a bit more in my next point related to the Director General. But then, obviously, it requires people, because people will then be, oh, that's ridiculous, or there will be people who think, oh, well, it should be banned because of X. There's a wide spectrum of thought between Rule Britannia is okay and having the word slaves in it should be banned. But there are definitely people who are going to fall on both sides of the spectrum, and the people who are passionate about both of those sides are going to be the people who shout at each other on Twitter, and then an online newspaper. You wouldn't get it in. Well, I assume you don't get tweets printed in print newspapers very often. Still, but even the BBC website will embed tweets when there's a relevant tweet to a story. So, the fact that there'll be what is essentially a falsehood, a non-story. It will go out. People will share it on Twitter. People will get annoyed about it on Twitter. People will go at each other on Twitter, and then stories will be published about the ongoing Twitter debacle, even on the BBC. And you kind of feel like the BBC shouldn't really just be reporting on Twitter threads. That's not what they're there for, but that's what happens. And then suddenly it's a news story when realistically nothing untoward was happening at all to start with.
Precisely. And people like Davey say it could be distracting people from the real issues. I think that we could point at quite a few real issues at the moment. We could say this story first started when it was in the aftermath of the exams debacle, and COVID's still going on. And there's a lot of questions that the government still has to answer. So a story like this coming up for a Conservative government to bash the BBC for a bit, and for them to look, for them to rally their support, for people to say, there may be Conservatives whose confidence in the in Boris Johnson's ability to govern has been shaken by what's happened with exams and what's happened with COVID. But if he can reinforce in their minds that he's sticking up for their cultural history by making sure Rule Britannia is sung, that might be enough to just plant the idea in somebody's mind to say, yeah, I'll vote for them next time because they stood up for me and I agree with that thing. So yeah, I just think the culture wars look like they're here to stay and will continue, and there will continue to be flashpoints on them, but I do see them ultimately as a distraction tactic from what's really going on and some of the more important concrete matters where you can try and drill down and get a definitive answer, because So
the one thing I do want to touch on briefly here is there is a new Director General of the BBC, and a perfect example of a non-story here is that sources near new Director General, unnamed sources, and I've heard a lot of criticism of unnamed sources in the US recently as well on a variety of political podcasts, said, new BBC boss is going to come in and ban all this left-wing comedy and ensure that there are more right-wing comedians, to which there was an ongoing, I think maybe the last week or so, and I've been involved in discourse about this with friends. I haven't tweeted about it because I felt like that's probably not going to help anyone. But, there was discussion of there aren't that many right-wing comedians, and then there was a quote from within the BBC saying, well, they've tried to find them, and they're like, here's the 4, and we book all 4 of them. This has been going back and forth. And then Tim Davie, this new boss, comes in, new Director General, and then he gives a speech where it's very much like, no, that was never a thing that was going to happen. We always seek out the best comedy, that's all we care about, etc., etc. So, I mean, obviously it remains to be seen what he does as Director General, but it very much sounds like this was someone reported a thing that wasn't true. It became a whole thing, and then, at the end of the day, it wasn't true.
And there was a big point. I think Stuart Lee did a big summary of this, a very good summary of what happened. And in the end, he kind of said the reporting of that speech by the new BBC General, Tim Davies, just that bit didn't really make it into the same papers that had been reporting that they were trying to ban right-wing comics, or they were trying to ban left-wing comics in the first place. So the conclusion to that story, which actually turned out to be quite a damp squib, makes its way to page 16 in the newspaper, if it even does. Meanwhile, the thing that started that whole conversation from an unknown source, that's what hit the front pages. So having that disconnect and having that, the power of an unknown source to try and stir up this storm when there's nothing happening and nothing was ever under threat, is a little bit scary. Yeah, it shows you how easily these can be picked up.
Yeah, and I think the point that we've raised before, I saw again an incorrect Facebook post by someone I know where they said, "Oh well, this is all of the newspapers are run by billionaires, and this is the problem," kind of thing. And I don't disagree with the sentiment, but I will point out that if you do want to read a decent newspaper, even though it's not published every day, you should read Private Eye, because the investigative journalism they do is very good. And if you listen to the latest podcast, Ian Hislop was making a variety of jokes about billionaire donors and how they've never had a donor and they've always wanted one. But it turns out all these billionaire donors are like closing down their newspapers because they're not profitable anymore. Whereas Private Eye seems to be doing gangbusters despite everyone being at home. So lots of subscriptions, I believe. I'd also recommend Private Eye's podcast called Page 94, which is a joke because there's never 94 pages in an episode of Private Eye, in an issue of Private Eye. And so if you turn to page 94, which is often where they link to in articles, there's nothing there. Our next headline from The Guardian: PM appoints misogynist Abbott as trade advisor. So we reference this in our joke up front. Who is Tony Abbott, other than an Australian?
He's the former Prime Minister of Australia, a former Conservative Prime Minister who got quite a bit of controversy whilst he was in power. Most notably, you may have seen this doing the rounds on the web. There is Julia Gillard, who was the opposition leader of the Labour Party at the time, basically trouncing Tony Abbott in a debate where Tony Abbott had said he didn't want any misogynists in his party, and Julia Gillard basically turns around and says that if he doesn't want any, he should have a good look in the mirror and resign immediately. I think it's gone down in history as like one of the speeches made in the Australian. Sticks with everybody.
Yeah, there's a very good episode, I'll try and find the link to throw in the show notes, of The Guilty Feminist, where they had her on discussing that, which I would recommend. Is very, very good. I also think another thing you will have seen doing the rounds this week is a very awkward interview with Matt Hancock, where someone said, well, what about the fact that he's a homophobe and a misogynist? And Matt Hancock goes, oh, he's very good on trade. And then they say, yeah, but what about this? And he goes, well, he's very good at trade, as if, like, not basically dodging the question. And it's almost as awkward as, did you threaten to overrule him? As, if we're talking famous political interviews.
So that, I think it might have been Kate Burley or somebody equally as sort of on it. But yeah, that was a car crash interview. And a little word about Matt Hancock. I feel sorry for him now. It's just the man can't catch a break. I'm not saying that I think he should have advanced anywhere beyond a salesman at a DFS, because I don't think his skills are beyond that. Apologies to, I stole that from Michael Spicer, who's a far better comedian than me, but Michael Spicer's very good. Matt Hancock just is never brought onto the TV to talk about anything nice, and then is really incapable of, answering a question, which, to be fair, is almost indefensible. They've had Conservative MPs on. I think there was one on the Daily Politics. I'm really sorry, I can't remember her name, but she was a Conservative backbencher who very plainly and bluntly said, I don't want this man representing the UK on any level. He's a proven misogynist, homophobe. No, thank you. So the fact that he has been, the fact that there was like a week of pressure on the government that was essentially people leaking, saying, oh, maybe this guy is going to be made trade advisor. Trade advisor, of course, being very important these days, because if Brexit negotiations are either concluded with a deal or without one, we will need to, try and get new trade partners from around the world. Clearly, Boris Johnson feels that Tony Abbott might be a good in, particularly with Australian trade, but I'm not quite sure how he will represent us around the world. There was a big worry about people that if you employ somebody like Tony Abbott, who is a misogynist, who has this track record of saying these awful things, that other countries might not respect him that much and might not want to go along with trade deals that he proposes. So the fact that this was ignored by the government and he was eventually appointed, I think kind of shows it shows that this government clearly doesn't worry about what the public or maybe what the media thinks. We've proved this again when we were talking about Gavin Williamson last time, and maybe when we were talking about Dominic Cummings. Those are scandals in which the media pressure from all the papers, it seemed, particularly with like Dominic Cummings and Gavin Williamson, and even from people on their side or within their own party. We saw the Daily Mail go hard on Gavin Williamson and particularly very hard on Dominic Cummings when he messed up. It still didn't lead to anyone being sacked or fired or resigning from that top table in cabinet. And the fact that the press has once again been unable to exert its pressure to maybe force Tony Abbott out of a job before he even had one, the fact the government ignores them, I think shows that the government feels very confident that it can do what it wants. Also, maybe that this government might learn the hard way that you can't just do what you want all the time and damn be to public opinion, because already the government's public opinion taken a hit. It's not below Labour yet, but there are some polls putting the Conservatives on level pegging with Labour, and considering where they were in December, to see them slip away that lead in just 9 months has got to be very concerning for the party.
Yeah. So ahead of our main story tonight, we're just going to have an advert for another show on the network. Good evening and welcome to the bar. Join Dr. Wilko as he investigates the histories of your favourite spirits and your favourite cocktails while mixing you a drink at the bar. The other bars may be closed, but a podcast bar will always remain open. So moving into our main story tonight, I think I'm not going to bother to phrase this any differently to the way it was phrased in our show notes by Rob. Let's sum up the US election race. Yes, let's. How's it going? We have our two contenders. We've had our two national conventions. Biden and Trump are now pitted against each other in the run-up to the general election, which is just over 2 months away, I believe. Is it? Or it might even be 2 months away.
Just under, maybe. Depends when the first Thursday.
I keep forgetting when the date is.
It's the first Thursday in November. 5th.
It's the 5th. Okay, yeah. So it's 2 months away. So, yeah.
How are we going to remember that, eh?
Well, Americans won't get that joke.
Okay,
so that's just there. There was an Easter egg for the Brits listening. So, yeah. How do you want to take this? Do we want to discuss the two candidates' pros and cons?
Yeah, let's take it that way. And I wanted to do this way because we've talked about it or brushed on our polls updates, but we haven't really had a big story on the US recently, or particular one focused on the election. And the fact that it's only 2 months away, we probably should just try and sum up the candidates, where they stand, and what I think their chances are this time. This will be a lot of opinion on where I think they are. So please do feel free to call me an idiot in the comments, send me horrible messages over Facebook, anything like that. Or particularly you, Tom, just to challenge me on a lot of these matters. But I feel from having seen what happened in 2016, I've got a fair idea of what could go on, or at least what the main strengths and weaknesses of each candidate. So yeah, let's start with them.
So we're going to start with Joe Biden then.
Arp. Let's start with Joe.
Good old Joe. I don't know where that accent came from. Secretly, he is a farmer from Cornwall.
So Joe Biden obviously won the Democratic race to be the presidential nominee, and he's a figure that people may remember from the past. He was Obama's vice president, and I'd say that that's one of his major strengths in a couple of ways. So, number one, because he's attached to Obama, who was the last successfully elected Democratic president, and one that I think is kind of, I don't want to say universally liked, but he's a president that seems to, even after his he had to stand down, people seem to still like him despite that. You get a lot of presidents that after they've served 8 years, people feel that, they've done their time, they should fade quietly into the background. Obama is one that's kind of stuck around for the past 4 years. There might be a few reasons about that, mainly because I think that Trump frames everything he does in relation to what Obama did, which probably isn't a great way of distancing yourself from a previous president, but that's something that's characterized the Trump era. And I also think there's some part of the Democrats that pines for the Obama era, where they had a candidate that was able to talk to young people and old people alike and transgress the boundaries that maybe they really struggled with under Hillary. When you compare it to 2016, Hillary had a lot of baggage behind her, not only her emails, but also she could be related to Bill Clinton. She is, she's Bill Clinton's wife. Bill Clinton has a lot of baggage from a long time ago that was certainly brought up during the last presidential election as well. And that kind of turned into this kind of toxic stew around Hillary last time that I think really hampered floating voters who weren't sure if they should vote for Hillary or Trump. And one of the big things that actually benefited Trump last time was the amount of people that decided that they weren't going to turn out, particularly African American voters who had voted for Obama in 2008 and 2012, but decided to stay at home in 2016. Because Biden has that link to the old Obama, to the old Obama regime, and we've seen it in his polling figures when he was elected as the Democratic nominee. He has that pull amongst black voters that Hillary simply didn't have. So I think that's one of the other big pros for Biden going into this election.
Yeah, and I think there was several episodes of Left, Right and Centre that have touched on this, but firstly, like we said, people talking about Bernie and other things, people have known for a while that Biden has this pull, and there is there seem to be, I hope I'm summarising this correctly, feel free to shout at me if not, but my understanding of the Left, Right and Centre episodes where they went over this is that it's basically two factors at work. Is that generally black voters are a bit more central, so the fact that Biden is not the leftist candidate that could be fielded helps there, but also he's not Trump. Like, there is definitely a strong not Trump effect in black voters' choices. So it seems like it's the two of those things tied together that's really helping him. I suppose, so you mentioned he has that connection to Obama, but it's also true that generally the president has an effective incumbency. Does he have a way of countering that, or does being an ex-vice president help in that regard?
I think it does to a degree that people already have an idea of who you are and have some name recognition. Now, if you've ever watched like a show like Veep, the office of the vice president is one of the more frustrating ones for the people who's in it, because they don't tend to do very much. Look at Mike Pence. What's he's up to now? He just seems to be rolled out to go to places that the president doesn't really want to go to. It probably was similar for Joe Biden when he was very much in the shadow of Obama during, the 2008, 2012 presidencies. However, the fact that he is vice president and he was vice president and some people already have that name recognition does mean people will turn out for him, and at least they have an idea of what he stands for. Even if you're not keeping up with politics all the time, like we are in particular, there's a lot of very casual voters in every democracy there who just want a quick shortcut to, hey, what's this guy about? The fact that he was Obama's vice president, again, works in his favor, because people might go, oh yeah, I remember that guy. I liked Obama. Okay, I'll vote for him. Rather than them having to do the legwork of saying, oh, I don't know, I've got to find out about this guy. Do I like him? I'm going to wait for the debates to make up my mind. People will probably already have an idea about what they think of Joe Biden, and hopefully for him, that will help, because at least it puts him on the same footing as Trump, as people knowing who they are. Everybody knows who Trump is. I think you'd have to be very hard-pressed to find somebody. Donald. Biden at least has some of that effect and some of that name recognition.
So I briefly mentioned Bernie earlier, and I think it is true. It's definitely my impression that the fact that he's not as left as Bernie helps his image, and maybe we'll get into the discussion of certain ads Trump has aired in the last week when we discuss this later. But how effective do you think the fact that he's not Bernie is to the average voter, not necessarily to the people who go to the Democratic convention?
Yeah, I think that the fact that he's not Bernie Sanders helps to blunt a number of Trump attacks in which Trump tries to label Biden as an extremist or somebody on the left. I'm not saying Bernie Sanders is an extremist, but there are certain things which Trump can try and say, oh, this is a radical left idea, and Biden represents the radical left, which Biden can actually turn back and say, no, I'm not, and here it is on a piece of paper. There was an interview around the time of Trump's infamous camera, woman, man, camera, TV, whatever it was. Oh no, person, woman, man, camera, TV interview around those cognitive tests, where also there was an interview with a journalist from Fox where Trump was trying to say, if you read Biden's manifesto, he's going to abolish the police. And the journalist came back and said, no, he isn't. Have you read it? Come back and read it and show me where it says that. And Trump was pretty sure in his view that that's what Biden had said, but then couldn't find it in the manifesto and had to kind of drop the point quite embarrassingly. So the fact that it was harder for Trump to attack him on those lines, and the fact that he's not so far to the left as Bernie Sanders was, means that the floating voter, the person in the middle, is more likely to gravitate to Biden. In particular, you're seeing a lot this election. You're seeing more disenfranchised Republicans, or people who were more traditional Republicans who have been pushed out of the Trumpian White House, now coming out and saying, hey, I will be voting for Joe Biden this time round, and this is why. I think maybe one of the most notable ones of that was John Kasich, who was one of the Republican presidential candidates in 2016 who ran against Trump. His face was in the Democratic National Convention saying, hey, I'm going to go out and vote for Biden. There's also a group online called the Lincoln Project, who you can probably see them on a lot of... Anytime Trump tweets, they'll have a response. But they're essentially a group of people who see themselves as traditional Republicans who have made it their mission to say, we're not voting for Trump this time round, and this is why. So the fact that he's not Bernie means that he can appeal to those across the aisle. He can reach out to Republicans who may have voted Trump thinking... It's weird to think back to 2016, but there was a lot of uncertainty about what Trump would do when he was in the White House. One of the theories was that, hey, maybe he'll calm down. Maybe he'll become more presidential. I will continue to vote Republican because I've never voted Democrat before, and I hope that Trump will put all this nonsense to the side once he's in power. I think it's fair to say now, after 4 years, that hasn't been the case, and that if you want to go back to a more traditional president, that Biden would be your only option.
Yeah, I mean, so on that point, as you say, Trump didn't return to, it wasn't all rhetoric. Actually, Trump has carried on to be a president in that, along those lines that he suggested with his speeches in the run-up to becoming president, as we all know. So how important is it that Biden is himself, not Trump?
Yeah, hugely important. And we might talk about this it is both a strength and a weakness for him, because the fact that you're not Trump is a big selling point for a lot of people, but you've got to be a bit more than that. But the Democrats seem to be leaning into that quite a bit. At the Democratic National Convention speech, Biden was talking a lot about how, the current president has been tin-eared and been unable to handle, various issues, most notably coronavirus protests and, Black Lives Matter, saying that he's been a very poor president for that issues. I will be a president that won't take that approach to these things. I will listen. I'll be empathetic. I shall show true leadership on this fact. And I think that's something that is a huge strength for Biden, saying that he can return to a president that cares. I think that was another strength of the Obama era, that the fact that Obama seemed to be a president that got worked up by things like school shootings and took them very seriously. You could see the genuine hurt whenever Obama had to make one of those speeches. With Trump, it's been pointed out that he kind of lacks the same empathy when it comes to those big presidential moments where you're meant to lead, and the fact that Trump has had 2 major tests and appears to be failing them at the moment, it's something where Biden can say, hey, that guy's awful, why don't you stop that and vote for me? Maybe the one problem with that tactic is that you have to also be your own thing. You can't it's not enough to just attack the other guy and say, aren't they awful? That was a big part of Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016. And ultimately voters decided that although they thought Trump was bad, they thought Hillary was equally dodgy on a number of issues. Now, I don't think Biden has quite the same baggage that Hillary does. But still, you need to have your own positive message rather than that negative message of Trump bad, vote for me instead.
So we've talked a bit about the strengths Biden has. What are his weaknesses, in your opinion?
So one that's been brought up quite a lot about media appearances from Biden are his age and his speech pattern. So this is one of the oldest presidential elections going to have. Trump is 74, Biden is 77. I think Biden, if elected, it would make him one of the oldest, if not the oldest president ever elected. Obviously, he's got to serve 4 years as well, so Biden will be 81 by the time it's 2024. It has been an issue in the past, one that Ronald Reagan quite famously dismissed off the cuff when he was somebody. There was a question in a debate where Ronald Reagan was said, do you think age is going to be a big factor or something in this campaign? And Ronald Reagan said, no, I don't think it's going to be a factor at all. The fact that my opponent is very young and inexperienced shouldn't affect the voters at all. So he was kind of turning it on his head and basically trying to get people to dismiss Reagan's old age and turning it into a strength that he was experiencing. Biden, on the other hand, has had some embarrassing moments on this campaign trail before, not only in the Democratic presidential race running up to it, where he seemed to stumble over his words in some debates. He's also had some TV appearances where he just struggles to get his words out a little bit. Now, he is somebody who formerly had a stutter, and he's been on record saying that you never really get over a stutter. It's something that you train out of yourself, and it can still come out on occasions. But it has led to some people worry that, how are his cognitive abilities? We've seen these questions about Trump, people also putting them against Biden. So I think that is one worry, and it's certainly one of those things that it promotes gaffes, it promotes videos that can be shared on social media, and whenever he does, I know that they, the Trump team in particular, pounce on them and try and see that as a weakness and as a reason why he shouldn't be leader. So although I don't think that it's really fair to have a go at him for a couple of slip-ups on television, I think it's worth pointing out that it's certainly something that his opponents will try and take advantage of and see as a weakness in his armor that they can exploit and try and get people who are undecided saying, hey, our guy's got it together. This guy has.
Yeah. And I think it's worth pointing out, Trump has a certain style, but it's quite enthusiastic. It's quite, it's bombastic. It definitely has a certain effect on crowds. Obviously a lot of what he says is either 100% wrong or just waffle. But Trump definitely has a way of drawing in, and he's kind of constantly stayed in the headlines with his speeches and stuff going through his presidency. Another thing to note, there's a link there about the oldest US presidents. Trump was the oldest president at his inauguration. So if Biden were to win, he would be the oldest again, being older than Trump. But yeah, there has been a tendency towards older presidents in recent years. The youngest being JFK. So kind of speaking, I suppose, on that point of Trump speeches and how their speeches compare, Biden comes over very measured, I would say, when you see him talk. There's not a lot of life to him. So compare him to, say, Bernie Sanders, who on the podium, despite his age, is very lively. Is that a problem?
I think it is an issue that, you can have a good measured leader and people will nod in agreement and say, oh, yes, he's sensible. But you also need somebody in your party who's going to whip up that enthusiasm to get your, the people out on the ground, sending the leaflets out, producing the social media, getting out the vote. That's a big part of campaigns too. And maybe a problem with, Biden not being Bernie Sanders. We know that Bernie had like a huge crowd-funded base of very young people who are willing to go out there, be bold, try and really start a conversation with people and get people voting who haven't done in the past. I think that's a slight weakness for Biden, where as he's a more traditional candidate, he might struggle to appeal to younger voters in particularly. Those, Bernie or bust may turn their back on the Democratic Party, as a whole for this election, or may vote for them begrudgingly rather than because it's the party they really want to go for. When you're comparing that to somebody like Trump is able to whip up enthusiasm from a lot of people in the way that he, you mentioned it when you were comparing, Trump's speech pattern and how he talks. At least with him, he does seem to whip up a crowd and get them behind him. I'm not quite sure Biden has quite the same effect on people. But then again, he might benefit from an election that is done more by mail, more of a socially distanced election, because then he doesn't have to do quite so much of the groundwork that a traditional president would have to. I'm not quite sure how it's going to work this year. Traditionally, presidents go all over the country and basically have public rallies in swing states and try and get their face out there and on the local news. This year, it's going to have to be very different. I assume it's going to be done at much more of a national level. Sure. Yeah, little side point there. I think that the lack of enthusiasm, the lack of ground game may turn out to be a bit of a weakness in the Biden campaign compared to if he was Bernie Sanders, who I think would definitely be able to garner the support amongst the young that on Twitter to get quite a big movement and quite a big momentum, a push behind.
On kind of following on from that point, I suppose. So one thing Trump was notably able to do was to speak to a certain section of America who felt they were underrepresented. People, all the arguments along the idea that their identity as Americans was being attacked, immigration, etc. We've seen similar things relating to Brexit over here. Is Biden's platform going far enough away from that? Because we've talked about how he's kind of that more central candidate and not necessarily as radical as Sanders, but Sanders had a lot of support. Will those people who would have otherwise supported Sanders drop off because they didn't get the kind of radical reforms they want with Sanders? Are you going to get disenfranchised youth, people who would normally be very progressive?
I think there's a risk of that, certainly. And you've got a lot of big issues going on at the moment. I think in particular, if you have a look at healthcare in the US, particularly around the coronavirus and things like the Black Lives Matter protests, those are issues which young people can quite rightly say, look, whether we've had a Republican or a Democrat in the White House, these things have always gone on to some degree. We need more radical change to make, within the police service, within the healthcare service, to make sure that, all people get healthcare free at point of use. Or the Black Lives Matter protests, for example, one of the big points about that was defunding the police and making sure that more money is put into social projects so the police aren't needed to try and calm down issues that might be surrounded by, mental health. I don't know why, a policeman with a gun is usually the worst way to try and de-escalate somebody who has mental health issues. However, that seems to be the thing that the American system leans on more time than not. And young people in particular say that, be it Trump or Biden in the White House, I don't see that much of a difference between them when it comes to those sort of matters. I believe Biden will still keep funding the police the same as Trump. That's the type of issues where you might start to lose people, that people might start to be disenfranchised. And if Biden fails to get those people out, to vote, people who are firmly in the Black Lives Matter protest camp, you wouldn't imagine any of those would ever vote for Trump, because of where they stand. But those people still might not come out and vote for Biden either because they don't feel he goes far enough. And the same would be said on healthcare, where Bernie Sanders was very clear that he was going to have universal healthcare and that was his policy. Biden's had to be a lot more measured. So when you balance it between his strengths, it's always a balancing act for the Democrats. I mean, it's a balancing act for every political party, but the act that Biden has to hold at the moment is I'm now appealing to those more in the center to try and get their vote and reaching across the aisle to Republicans. By doing that, I'm aware that I might lose people on the left of the party. I just hope that I'll gain more of those people in the center than I lose on the left. And he's got to hope that people who are quite far left will be more pragmatic and might say, hey, I've had enough of Trump, even though I don't agree with everything that Biden has said. And I don't think Biden will go far enough. I don't want my vote going towards Trump in any way, shape, or form. Here, have my vote this time. It's always that. Yeah, it's always that balancing act he's got to do. But when you look back to 2016, that's kind of what Hillary tried to do. Hillary was a very central candidate, and there are those who believe that Sanders would have beaten Trump in a straight race because Sanders was able to appeal to a large amount of the electorate that simply didn't turn out and vote for Hillary. I think the situation is very different this time, and I actually think that the central candidate is better now we've had 4 years of Trump. So I think this isn't so much of a weakness, but it certainly is a big talking point, and one where you see a lot of, again, like Twitter isn't necessarily representative of real life. I want to say that with quotation marks. It's not representative of the whole picture. However, that's where all the conversations happen, and it might force Biden to lose some momentum.
I would push back a little against this suggestion of a weakness, because while I have access to a small subsample of young Americans via places I hang out in Discord, while up until the point Biden was selected as the nominee, all the young voices I know were very, very left and very radical and saying, well, we want this, and this. Even those younger people I've spoken to, as Biden became obviously the nominee, they went, well, that's not my preferred option, but better than Trump. And I think, I think it can definitely be frustrating when you're that age and you can't vote for someone who represents you. Your first few elections it can be disheartening. You can't have kind of the feeling of the swell you get, if your first election has seats flipping in your favor to a progressive candidate who lines up with your views. But I think people very quickly switch to the thing that does the best for them. And if you're someone who's very left, you don't support Trump. And I definitely think there is a small percentage of people who say, "Oh, I'm never voting again." And I saw a few people talk about it a bit in the run up to some of our elections. I think in the run up to the second Cameron election, I saw a few people saying, "Oh, I'm never voting again." Now that things are not in their favour, I don't think I know any person personally who has not switched to, well, I'm voting against the Conservatives in the UK. And I think you get the same kind of flip happening in the US. Obviously, I don't have a perfect sample size. I can't speak to every person of voting age in America. Otherwise, this would be a very different show. But the impression I get is that it's less of a problem than that may seem. And I think most people are understanding the fact that if they are a radical left-leaning person, getting Biden into power is a step closer, and then they can worry about, who's in the Senate, things like that. There are other ways to do it.
I agree, and that's one of the big factors to look out for on election night. In short, if turnout is high, then that will favour Biden. If turnout is low, then that will go against Biden. Then you're looking at something that was the problem that Hillary had, was that she didn't turn out as many people as she should have done, and that played into Trump's hands. So that's just another thing to look out for. I think from what you've said, it's hopeful that those people will turn out despite there's some reservations about Biden. But that's one of the key defining factors in deciding the election, is getting people out to vote, or making sure that they post their ballots 2 weeks before, or whatever it's going to be this time.
So our final potential weakness for Biden, is this actually a change for the Democrats, or is this just Obama light? Or in fact, given what Biden looks like, Obama white?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say. Clearly, politics has moved on quite a bit from 2012, so Biden will have policies that are, more turned towards, the issues that we're facing in 2020. But traditionally, when a new candidate comes up against an incumbent, they will have an overall message of change, and why don't we change things for the better and to something new. The fact that Biden was a previous vice president for Obama, some people might see that as turning back the clock in either a good way or a bad way to the Obama era. That might be a slight disadvantage, particularly if he's reaching across the aisle to Republicans who wouldn't have voted for Obama in the past. Are they willing to vote for Biden, knowing maybe things will go back to how they were in, similarly to 2008 or 2012? I'm not sure. It's more of a minor point here, but the fact that he's not, if you compare it to Trump in 2016, I think you could argue that Trump represented a real change in American politics. You can argue whether that was for better or for worse, but he definitely was going to shake things up. Is Biden going to do the same? It's unlikely, but maybe that's a strength. Maybe people have a return to normalcy, and they see that as they don't mind turning back the clock. But traditionally, you would identify this as a weakness. It's not a lot of times that a challenger will say, yeah, we're just going to take things back to the way things were 4 or 5 years ago, as attractive as that. Speaking in 2020, turning the clock back to 2015. does seem like quite an attractive prospect right now.
Yeah. So, moving on from Biden then, Trump, what are his strengths? What's his biggest strength?
So I think one of the more remarkable strengths that Trump has had is his ability to keep a very strong base of support. We've always talked about the Trump base, even back in 2016 when he was running for president. It was a big point when he was trying to knock out other Republican candidates. People thought, oh, this guy's base is only 10%, then it turned to 20% since he's been president. He seems to have a good 40% of Americans on side, apparently, no matter what he does. And Trump has really put this to the test over the last 4 years, I think it's fair to say. This is, just as a slight side point, I think this is one of the elections where we're seeing the least amount of floating voters because of the way Trump has governed in the past 4 years. I think you know who Trump is and you know what he stands for on a lot of issues. And 40% of the public are willing to go along with it. And that is, although it's not 50%, it's not the 50% he needs, to have that 40% nailed on fills Trump with confidence quite clearly. And when you compare that to other Republican presidents in the past, or when you have a look at presidential approval ratings, what tends to happen is that they can go down into the low 30s, low 20s at the end of like a lame duck presidency, or at the end of somebody's 8 years in charge, or sometimes after 4 years. It dwindles a lot because not only are they alienating, let's take a Republican president, not only are they alienating Democrats who would never vote Republican in the first place, but they've also let down some of the Republicans who thought they were going to do something while they were in power and didn't. And because they're unable to keep up that enthusiasm, their overall support dwindles to about 20% in the polls. The fact that Trump has been able to keep it at 40% and keep that enthusiasm up against for quite a wide section of America is definitely a strength, and something that I don't think any other president in the past has really been able to harness in the same way.
Because it's definitely interesting that he can keep that, because sure, there are the Republicans who will always vote Republican, but as you say, like if he came on this kind of, I'm going to drain the swamp, I'm going to change things, realistically hasn't achieved any of those aims, but it seems like that just doesn't matter to the people who are fervently pro-Trump.
Yeah, totally. And maybe going back to like the culture war points, he doesn't, those things that he promised don't seem to matter because he sets himself apart as the person who's going to defend a certain group of people's rights against the evils of the Democrats. So you said you'd seen some advertising for the Trump campaign, is that right?
I haven't watched all of them, but the adverts I was referring to are the ones that suggested that Biden was being controlled by a radical left, which obviously is not the case. The idea that letting Biden in is letting in Sanders, AOC, etc., because there are more left-leaning people in his party, which is, I think, is a false equivalency.
Yeah, that is, yeah, you're right, it is. And, to the outsider, it seems quite silly, but to Trump's base and the people who feel they need protecting from those ones, they feel Trump is a strong leader who will stand up for their rights in that matter. Other big groups that support him, religious groups, think that he's wonderful, particularly for the judges that he's been able to put onto the Supreme Court. They see as the fight for abortion rights, and some were even pondering if they could get Roe versus Wade overturned during Trump's presidency. That hasn't happened, but the fact that he's putting in conservative judges to vote conservatively on key moral issues for the country is a big appeal to those sort of religious groups as well, and particularly in Middle America, those states that feel Trump's big strength in 2016 is he was able to appeal to that Middle America belt, the one that was traditionally they're traditionally bellwethers, but Democrats felt like they had a good chance because you tend to have more of the working class blue collar workers there. Trump really was able to get a good grip on the non-college educated white vote in those areas.
That's very much where he followed the line of, we're going to bring jobs back to America, that kind of thing.
Yeah, precisely. And And that rhetoric hasn't changed at all over the 4 years. And you can say what you like about Trump, but he's been very consistent on those points, even if he's failed to put most of them into any concrete action. Boy, has he talked about them a lot and defending those people's rights. So that base feels very much like they have an affinity with Trump on those issues. So yeah, I feel that's where Trump's main strengths lie, in those sort of areas. And I don't see any big issue really affecting that at the moment. I don't see what during the election campaign is going to shake that 40% and say that, no, they're not going to vote Trump. I don't see Trump suddenly coming out as being very anti-religious in any way. He knows his base. He knows what they like. He's going to keep saying those lines, and to hell with what those in the centre think about it. He needs to keep those people on side, and he'll continue to do so.
It's an interesting point, because you've listed here 3 strengths that we've all essentially covered here: strong base, strong appeal to Middle America, and strong appeal amongst religious groups. And I know there are some people who are diehard Trump fans, regardless of what he does. But it's interesting that there's Middle America, where he's, as you say, he's done a lot of talk, but hasn't really achieved much in the way of moving jobs back from China and stuff that were perceived to be lost, for example. Or he said a lot about building a wall. He said a lot about cracking down on immigrants. But while things have happened, it doesn't seem like much has actually changed in that regard. And then similarly, this kind of appeal amongst religious groups, where bearing in mind some of the allegations that have been levelled about Trump, about bathrooms and certain types of shower, you'd think they probably wouldn't be pro him, but it seems like, his kind of the idea that maybe at some point he might do something about abortions, and because he keeps talking about it, seems to have kept that base going. So it's interesting that despite his failings, those various appeals have not really changed. On a kind of similar point, moving on to another thing that I think is a strength of his, we talked about this a bit when we were talking about Biden, and his the fact that his speech pattern and so on is a potential weakness. He is very much able to go out there and make headlines, as I mentioned earlier, and even in the middle of a pandemic, apparently draw quite a large crowd.
Yeah, he can. It's always been a strength from Trump back in 2016 that he was able to bypass some of the traditional campaign methods to get your face out there by, mainly Trump's tactic was to say some wild stuff, hold rallies where people were screaming, and the media will cover it and get your face everywhere, and you don't have to pay for campaign ads or anything like that because you're already the story. It's something Trump did very well when he was in business, and he repeated it in 2016, and he keeps going at it today. Trump rallies have been a feature of the presidency since 2016, and it appears that the president has like a constant campaign mindset. He's been doing them periodically every year while he's been in power. And there's a great John Sopel article that I think I mentioned last time that mentions that Trump seems to draw energy from them, and he sees rallies as a good way of trying to lead on a story whilst also just kind of throwing ideas out there, seeing what appeals to his base. The people who turn up to Trump rallies are going to be the Trumpiest of people. So if he can draw a cheer from them, then he might go, oh, okay, that's good. I'll keep those 3 ideas that had a cheer. The 2 that I tried and didn't get much of a response, I won't talk about. And then he can kind of create a path to winning those voters from there. You mentioned about drawing a crowd during a pandemic. One thing that John Sopel article points out is that he talks about the campaign rally that was done a couple of months ago, like when just as the pandemic, just before America had those big spikes in Florida, etc. But it was the rally in Tulsa, the one which Trump bragged that there were going to be 1 million people there, and they'd booked Nigel Farage to speak to people outside in the end. Apparently, due to a combination of people unwilling to turn out because of the coronavirus outbreak that was happening in Tulsa at the time, plus K-pop fans buying up tickets on the web when they actually had no intention of going, that kind of maybe showed the first weakness Trump had, is that he couldn't always draw a crowd, or that people weren't always willing to come out come what may. And John Sopel mentions in this article how that seemed to have quite the effect on Trump, that instead of being and something that recharged his energy, in fact, drained him and made him more worried about the fight ahead. We're yet to see if Trump will still hold rallies in the same way in the next coming 2 months. He's going to have to do something to try and get his face out there. And I think Trump within the White House and his press briefings are certainly more frustrated when he's faced with a room of journalists who will question his every mood rather than a very supportive crowd who are willing to cheer him for most stuff. So that'll be an interesting point for Trump. Another one of Trump's major strengths, I think, is that, even if he is talking to the media, he's a very good counterpuncher. And if people attack him, which there have been no shortage of attacks on Trump during his presidency, he will usually bite back and try and bite back harder. That, once again, is something that his base likes to see because it reinforces their projection that he's willing to stand up for them come what may. If it endears himself to the rest of America, that's another discussion. But again, it's another one of Trump's strengths for keeping his base on side.
So, talking about how he appeals to various types of voter, another thing he's been doing against Biden recently is this idea of a strong law and order campaign, especially in the face of Black Lives Matter. Do you think that is a strength of it? I mean, I know it's not a thing we agree with, but do you think that is going to act as a strength for him in certain bases?
I think it will, in particular when Trump has a very city versus countryside sort of city versus rural aesthetic, where he will have a look and say, look at all this chaos that's going on in the cities. These cities run by Democratic mayors. They're not strong on law and order. If you want to keep law and order, vote for me. I'll make sure that I'll send lots of police there and sort that out. Now, that doesn't appeal to those Democrats living in cities at all one bit, and I think we've discussed previously how a lot of the time sending in police can often exacerbate the situation and make it worse. But if you're somebody living quite detached from those protests actually happening outside your front door, and you're living into a rural area of the country, and you might be worried that similar protests might come to your sleepy little town, if you don't, that might be something where you're like, yeah, I want strong law and order, and I want more places to be like my sleepy town. He will, as we've said, Trump has got this strong base in Middle America. Points where he's talking about strong law and order certainly appeal to rural constituencies far more, and that's where the majority of his base is, once again. And the fact that he's not afraid to send in police, and the fact that he hasn't changed his tactics despite all of the, the ongoing protests in cities up and down the country now in the US, I think it's hard to say that you can't be unsure of what Trump's going to do. He's at least consistent in his message on that fact. And I think it is one that might play well in rural America. However, I don't think it's going to play so well in the cities. But Trump would then shrug his shoulders and say, why does he care? He's probably going to lose those constituencies anyway. It's better for him to double down where he has support and try and win the 2016 election all over again. We've got to remember that he won last time. If he does exactly the same as he does last time, that's all he needs to do, get the same amount of voters on side, and he's got a good chance of winning the Electoral College vote. So that's why you see Trump doubling down in those areas and really trying to strengthen his, strengthen his whole, I don't know, just try and strengthen his support amongst that core group.
So if those are his strengths, which I think, despite your list of 5 items, really boils down to 3 items because of how the bases are 1 point in my mind. So if those are his strengths, what are his weaknesses? I think this is a very long list, but let's try and keep it to a short list. So following on from that idea of law and order, that feels a bit of a strange message to be doing post Black Lives Matter and all of that. It seems like, definitely to me, it's the wrong message. And I think there are like-minded people in the US. We've already talked about how black voters are more likely to vote for Biden. I wouldn't be surprised if that's part of the reason as well, other than the stuff we've already touched on. He's divisive, for want of a better word.
Yeah, and that means that you're always going to kill controversy, and maybe that's not the role of a president. In the past, a president's role would have been to try and be a healer for these times, come in and try and diffuse the situation in a way and say, right, let's get people around the table, let's talk, I'll try and take the sting out of this, and let's unite behind like the flag. That would be, I'm talking great generalizations here, but that's kind of what the role of a traditional president would be. What Trump has done is he's tried to fan the flames and stoke them even more, and you saw that after the George Floyd death, that there were a lot of protests, and Trump's response was to send in more police, and that worsened the situation. So a new wave of protests have happened around the Jacob Blake shooting, which, I mean, the footage is out there on Twitter. Just be aware that it's horrible footage to see, but yeah, a policeman just gets out his gun and shoots somebody 7 times in the back, which is just inexcusable in my eyes, just to see it happen.
There's no way that is reasonable force, and especially if that person doesn't have a gun. But there's a whole load of stuff we could go into here. But yeah, just to say, not okay.
Yes, very much not okay. And that sparked a new wave of protests. Trump went to the town where that happened and said that he wouldn't be meeting with the family. Instead, he took some photo opportunities outside buildings that had been damaged in protests and kind of tried to mark that as a sign of Joe Biden's America, even though we're actually in Trump's America at the moment, so I'm not quite sure how that how well that plays, but he is trying to play those riot signs as, this is what Joe Biden's America will be like. The fact that he refused to meet with the victim's father, whereas Biden said that he will and have that conversation, is another big change, the way that Trump does things. And again, I don't think appeals to those people who are looking for a less divisive president in a time where you've got a lot of stuff going on. Coronavirus has been something that's dominated 2020, and to have these protests all at the same time, you'd think that a lot of people are looking for somebody to heal the country. I think I'm fair in saying that Trump is not a healing figure for the United States, and I don't think he's going to bring the country together like I think Biden would, or at least Biden's rhetoric is far more that of somebody who is looking to heal divides and speak across the aisle to Republicans rather than Trump's far more, Trump's base is very strong, but obviously that comes with a massive weakness of you're alienating the other 60% of people potentially. Last time Trump was able to keep enough of those people who voted Republican on side in the election, but it's possible this time round he will fail to do so, and that he will have focused on his base too much.
So we have already talked about Middle America, but so I think we need to unpack 2 different ideas here. There's Middle America, which is a location and wealth-based kind of idea, right? Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, correct, yeah.
And then you also have the middle, as in the idea of centrist people. So one would assume that centrists are not fans of Trump, who is, you could describe him as a radical right-wing person based on his views. Like you would assume that there are people who are more left of Trump in general within the Republican Party who form the base of it. So he presumably does not appeal to those people in the center, whereas Biden might. Yes,
and I think not only does he not appeal, he's making almost zero effort to appeal to those people in the center. We haven't really focused on the conventions that much, but it was striking, I think, from the Republican National Convention, particularly with the amount of speakers that had the surname Trump. The Republican Party has, over the past 4 years, become far more Trumpian in its outlook. He's taken, if you want to be part of Trump's gang, if you want to be in power, then you have to share his views. He's not one for taking in a broad church of views on the conservative right. And that has the effect of alienating those who were once long-time Republicans. I've mentioned John Kasich as probably the most high-profile senator coming out against him, but you've got, he certainly didn't make very many friends with the McCains whilst he's been in power, Trump as well. And you're seeing kind of a growing disquiet from those on the center-right, or those who thought that the Republican Party was, I'm right-wing economically, but I might not be right-wing in my social views. I just, vote Republican because I believe they're the best to, deal with the economy. That type of voter will probably find it a bit hard morally, I guess, to vote for Trump, seeing what he's done within 4 years of power. So, yeah, that lack of being able, we're talking about Biden all about reaching across the aisle. Trump is not about that at all. He's just planning on rerunning the 2016 election and saying, right, I got that vote, so that was enough last time. Let's do it again. That works. I don't know if that's going to be enough this time.
So what I'm getting here is that the Lib Dems should set up shop in America.
Well, we can talk about two-party politics and how that is affecting America on another issue. Yeah, exactly.
For the future. So, again, something we touched on earlier a bit. He was originally, he was change. So Obama was hope. And then I think, we talked a bit about how Biden, whether he would be a return to the Obama era. And Obama was like hope. And then, how much you like Obama. There were things, things like drone strikes and stuff that came up in the end of his presidency, which aren't great. And then similarly, Trump went on this idea of change, drain the swamp, etc. I know we've already touched on his base and how it hasn't necessarily seemed to be affected by the fact he hasn't actually achieved any of his aims. But he doesn't have that agenda anymore. How is he going to get more people to vote for him outside of that already fired up base?
Yeah, precisely. The fact that he's not a change, or at least the change that he tried to implement has been unsuccessful, I think will shake voters, particularly maybe those Republicans who thought he could get something done and can't. Now, a lot of the time Trump has spoken about not about his failure to get things done, but he's placed the blame, why hasn't the wall been built yet? I think Trump would come back and say, well, it's because of obstructionist Democrats. Particularly once he lost the midterm elections and lost the support of the House, that's been an excuse that he can sort of roll out and say, oh, I would be able to get everything done, but this damn Congress is split, and that's why I can't get anything done. And that's why the wall isn't built. Traditionally, if you look at how presidents have ruled in the past, most presidents have actually had a split House and Congress and have had to come with compromises to try and get deals through the House to make sure some of their agenda is implemented. The fact that Trump has kind of ruled by executive order, trying to get around Congress and the House any way that he can to try and get his agenda out there, shows that he was always going to fail to get any of those big plans through, because he was meant to be the deal maker, but he was incapable of doing a deal when it came to discussing things with a Democratic House on trying to balance those two parties. So yeah, I think that is, again, not for his base an issue, but for those outside who can look at it quite critically, they can say, yeah, this has been a failure for many levels, and you can't say, you can't go with that message of make America great again. He's had 4 years to do that.
Has he made America great in the last 4 years? Some would say no.
I think that's, yeah. If I was a Democrat campaign, person who was going to put together an advert campaign, that would be one of the first questions I would ask the voter. Is America great again, or how does the world view America? Do you feel in a better place, etc., etc.?
I can envisage it now. Picture of Trump. I'm going to make America great again, and then it'd be like, did he do it? And lots of no pictures over whatever various talking points they want to point out. Yeah,
precisely. And I just one quick side note about that. If you want a very good example of a Trump idea that we all knew was going to fail at the start and then continue to fail, but just it's amazing how spectacularly it has failed. John Oliver did a very good piece on the building of the wall on Last Week Tonight, which I strongly recommend you watch, because it's a very good case study. Trumpian ways and thinking. And how.
And also the fact that various members of his previous inner circle are now in court because they stole a lot of money while claiming to go towards building the wall. But that's, again, an issue for another time. There's a lot going on right now in politics. So I suppose talking more on his weaknesses, when Trump came into power, there is a much longer discussion we could have another time, maybe as a special episode, talking about how often it seems like right-wing parties seem to take power just as there's an economic upswing and then say, oh, look how good we are at the economy. And I very much feel that's the position America was in as Trump started. He was like, I'm going to promise a better economy. Obama had done a load of things following the financial crash, and those were all starting to pay off as it was passed over to Trump. And Trump could easily claim, oh, look, I've improved the economy, even if he did nothing to achieve it. I'm going to, again, gesture vaguely in the outside direction where there may be, as you were aware, a virus going around. It seems like the economy has somewhat tanked in the US in the last 6 to 9 months for obvious reasons. So how is he going to dig himself out of that hole, or can he?
Yeah, I don't think he's found a way. I think Trump was somebody who loved to bleat on about, how well the stock markets were doing, how your 401k had improved. The coronavirus has completely undermined those talking points and made it so he barely mentions them in speeches anymore. He doesn't want to talk about the economy because it's not a strength, and it used to be. And traditionally, how the economy functions or how it's been doing in the past is a big deciding factor on how people vote in the election. Now, I think voters are, maybe pragmatic enough to say, look, no president could have mitigated the effects of what would happen in a pandemic. And there's always got to be some way to bounce back from that. The fact that there was a pandemic isn't entirely Trump's fault. But the fact that he's just unwilling to talk about it, and economic recovery isn't really a major part of his speeches anymore, shows that he feels that this is a weakness and something that he would rather not talk about, because it's very easy for somebody to say, hey, look, you've got a couple of problems here. And I don't know if Trump really has the solutions to those problems yet. I think any solutions that he has tried, trying to get people out to, just business as usual, were suddenly put on, they suddenly had to put the brakes on as you saw those spikes happen in other places around America that hadn't been affected previously. So that kind of second wave, although you could argue in America they went from the first to second wave and didn't really have a dip in the middle. The fact that he hasn't really been able to talk about the economy and boast it as a strength is a real weakness for Trump, and it'll be interesting to see what he does in the debates if pressed on it, because guess what? There's always going to be a question on the economy in the debates. You're not going to be able to get away from. I don't think he's really come up with a strategy yet to combat what people are going to say.
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning here that this is very much, it's one of those things where the public's perception plays into it more. I mean, I alluded to the fact that Trump came in and had a strong economic period, and I think most of that was attributable to stuff undertaken before his term, because you can't just turn the economy on like a switch, no matter how much leaders would wish they could. But there's a very good episode of the Freakonomics podcast which goes into how little of an effect the president actually has on economic outcomes. And there's definitely effects of the institutions and the people they can put into power in various places. But it's just interesting, people's perception of how important the president is on the economy is quite disconnected from the reality. But that means that even if, it's coronavirus, etc., it's not his fault that things have currently tanked. I mean, you can discuss mitigation strategies and stuff for a long time, but regardless of how involved he is in the effect on the economy right now, bad economy, people think bad president. It doesn't really matter how much effect he actually had one way or the other. Your final point, we've kind of covered, I feel. Or do you just want to round out with that?
Yeah, I think my final point, I know we've covered it with the, new/change agenda from last time point, but yeah, his message has changed from, make America great again to keep America great. The big question is, does America feel great right now? I feel that his, linking it back to the first point, him trying to promote this law and order under Trump, chaos under Joe Biden. For our UK listeners, where have you heard that phrase before? With old David Cameron, strong and stable under the Conservatives and chaos under Ed Miliband. I feel like that's the tactic he's going for. However, it's very clear to see after 4 years that there's a lot of chaos going on right now. And has he kept America great or even made it great under his 4 years? I think that's got to be a huge undermining factor for that floating voter we've been talking about, that central undecided voter. As I said, it's very hard to imagine anyone being undecided when Trump is so strong in his views. But there are those people who will be wavering, who, I think particularly Biden is it's a very good strategy for Biden to target Republicans who are thinking of switching, because everything that Trump does, I think, would push me as a central Republican away from Trump and towards Biden, rather than the other way around. I don't see anything where Trump kind of reaches to those people and says, hey, vote for me. I think Trump kind of just assumes that they're going to vote for him no matter what. But this whole Keep America Great slogan, I think, is far less effective than the last one. Not as catchy. You can see kind of, whereas the first one was full of promise and the hope of what if under Trump, I think this one is kind of like, do I want to keep this status quo? This seems kind of bad. 2020 is a hellhole. Please get me out of here as fast as possible. Please, please. Oh, God. So, yeah, bad slogan, basically. And I don't think it will be, a vote winner when it comes to November.
So, having just had that discussion, I just want to briefly touch on the polls. This is even shorter than the usual quick polls update, because we've discussed at length our feelings, for and against the two candidates. When we last spoke, Biden had a 9-point lead using the 538 summary of all the polls. That has now dropped to only a 7.4% lead. But I think one thing that is interesting, if you look at that, is before the polls were quite spread out. You even had like some Trump polls suggesting in the end of August, start of September, that Trump would be up to maybe even 48%. So all of those polls have returned in favour of Biden. But now you can see these, at least in the last few days, it seems like those polls have clumped around their percentages. So while the percentage has narrowed, it seems like the polls are generally agreeing more on those results, as opposed to being all over the place. So, yeah, I'm not 100% sure what happened at the very end of August to give that tiny boost to Trump and that drop to Biden, because we'd already talked about the Republican convention at that point.
But it will be the convention.
It'll be the delayed effect with the polls, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a delayed effect. So they usually have slight bumps, and I think Trump definitely had a bump. But there's signs already that bump is slipping slightly.
Yeah, I mean, it's already slipped a little bit. And Biden is, but Biden still looks to be in a good position. But as we know from before, 2 months to go, you can't call it yet. It will be all right on the night, that kind of, all that jazz. So, yeah, I think we'll keep our eyes peeled, and we'll be having our quick polls updates on that through the rest of the season. Well, up until the election night. So, as always, Rob, thank you for joining me. Thank you for giving your insights into all things political. You can find us, if you want to follow us, you can find us at parliamentary.observer, our website, where you can comment on episodes. You can find all the links to find us in whatever podcatcher you use. You can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/TTSS, where you can support any of our shows from $1 a month, and you can get access to bonus content, including a chat that Rob and I had before this show started, which we do as our kind of warm-up. That is now going to be our thing for this particular podcast. You will find also various other things in that feed, including outtakes and things. You can find us on Twitter as Unpub Podcast. You can find us on Instagram as Unpub Podcast. You can find us on Reddit /r/Unparliamentary, and you can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. Just search for us, and you will find us in all those places. Like, subscribe, share, whatever it is to spread the word about the podcast. Obviously, if you can support us, that's great. And we thank you for listening. I don't think there's anything else left for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him.
Bye.
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 Bye.